Okay, perfect. So some of the slides that I will be presenting, you'll see kind of more the Forta branding, because these are some of the slides and presentations that I've given in the past. And so this presentation here is really a blockchain security introduction. And I am primarily going to talk about kind of the various techniques around how users and protocols can get exploited. Why do we care about this space? Well, there is a lot of money in the system. These slides are a little bit out of date, but you know, it's trillions of dollars in market cap, billions of dollars locked into smart contracts. And there's a lot of money to be had, and what that does, it really attracts a lot of attention from people that want to steal it. The type of people that are involved in stealing these assets are not the script kiddies. I talked about the Ronin Bridge attack that happened earlier this year. $624 million were stolen in one attack. And the US government associated the Lazarus Group, which is associated with the North Korean government, behind this attack. And that group has not only hacked the Ronin Bridge, but many more protocols on chain. And so you have to think about that. These are, you know, well-funded, persistent in terms of effort, attackers. And they will, you know, poke at your protocol until they find a bug that they can exploit. 51% attack. We talked about. Oh, and one thing, I don't see any questions. So if you have questions, please just kind of get off mute and speak. Feel free to interrupt me. 51% attack, we already talked about. This is really about you know, having enough hashing power to create a longer blockchain than the legitimate blockchain. One thing to keep in mind here is that this is the properties of the protocol are still intact. So even if you're performing a 51% attack, you're not able to generate blocks that don't adhere to the rules of the protocol, right? So I cannot create a block that, you know, generates ETH out of thin air, because that is not valid. But what I can do is I can trigger double spends, and then also I can essentially deny transactions.
If you like, given 51% in time, can't you create a hard fork or create a fork, which would effectively unwind recent transactions? Like, I think this is like not feasible from a cost point of view in most cases, but is, because in theory I could say I have enough to start to change behavior from a block as a parent, and I can start to write new blocks as children from that point in time parent. And once I catch up, I should be able to, like, assuming I have enough compute power to go faster than the rest of the network, at some point I catch up past the rest of the network and my fork becomes dominant.
You can always hard fork. Like, I could hard fork Ethereum right now and mine Ethereum going forward. But that fork is essentially rejected because nobody else uses that same code, right? And to kind of break the protocol rules, you would have to do a hard fork.
Yeah. Okay.
And yeah, I mean, there are, you know, hard forks happen all the time, right? It just happened a few weeks ago when Ethereum moved to proof of stake. There was a hard fork that was essentially continuing proof of work. I don't know where that project is, but if it's not accepted by the community, then essentially it will die. And then whatever Ethereum you procure it out of thin air will be essentially worthless.
Okay, that makes sense.
Wallets, we already talked about wallets. One thing that we haven't really talked about, the difference between kind of custodial and non-custodial wallets. Non-custodial wallets are the wallets that you all have installed right now with MetaMask, right? The key is stored locally. But then, of course, you could also just have your wallet with a centralized exchange like Binance or Coinbase. And what happens there is essentially the company manages the private keys for you. Whereas on the non-custodial wallets, you have to manage your private keys. And so with that, there's a different risk profile, right? If you don't secure your machine, for instance, well, the private key could get stolen. Whereas if I think about, Binance and Coinbase, they have, a professional team that manages keys. And so there's a general trade-off. And then also, how do you then kind of access your wallet in a custodial setup, right? If you log onto Coinbase, you probably have two-factor authentication enabled. But if you have a username, password, and then that two-factor auth capability, you're able to operate on somebody's digital assets. Whereas in the non-custodial world, you do need to have the private key. There was something interesting that happened a few weeks ago where on Ethereum, it seemed like attackers were able to control addresses that didn't belong to them. And what turned out to be the case is that those addresses were generated with a tool called profanity. And profanity is a tool that allows you to generate vanity addresses. So think of an address that starts with 7 zeros. Because I guess it's cool to have an address that starts with 7 zeros. And the way that tool works is it essentially generates a private key randomly, derives the public address, and if it starts with 7 zeros, it basically says, hey, I found an address that starts with these 7 zeros. If not, it will continue to iterate. And I described that the tool essentially works by generating a random private key. Well, that statement was not entirely true. The tool
they had like a bad seed, so you could reproduce the randomness.
That's right. Yeah. Essentially, it basically selected from a set of seed values that were, a small space essentially of seed values, and so you could then take a public key that you find on chain and derive the private key from it. And so a very serious vulnerability that impacted several projects. Wintermute was one of them, where millions of dollars were stolen. Because basically what that allowed attackers to do is take control of addresses with specific roles. And I very much expect that this vulnerability will haunt us for at least months, if not years to come. So the point here is like if you're generating a non-custodial wallet, it's not just important how you manage your keys, but also how you generate your keys. Then if you have a non-custodial wallet locally on your machine, you have to think about that there's traditional malware that may infect your machine that is specifically designed to steal your private keys. And these are pretty sophisticated. They use a variety of techniques. So there are some that essentially scrape the processes for private keys in memory. There's malware that essentially scours your disk for plain text keys or seed phrases. There's malware that captures your mouse movements and keystrokes, be able to get to your seed phrase or your password and PIN, whatever. There's malware that looks at your browser cache to obtain information. There's also malware that switches your clipboard. So if you, for instance, if I want to transfer ETH to Priya and she sends me an email with her address, and I copy that address from the email into my wallet, there's malware that switches that out. And if you don't pay attention, you may sign a transaction that transfers to the attacker. And then lastly, so hardware wallets, I don't know whether we talked about that. So hardware wallets are essentially non-custodial wallets that have a secure enclave that is not accessible from the outside to manage your keys. And hardware wallets essentially only allow input into the hardware wallet. That then gets essentially signed, and the signed transaction comes back. So the key itself is not really accessible directly, at least. And hardware wallets are essentially, think of it as kind of like USB sticks with that secure enclave. But there are side channel attacks where you kind of interact with the hardware wallet. You measure currents, and that may allow you to derive the private key that is stored in the secure enclave. Obviously, not for the average person, but certainly researchers have demonstrated this as a proof of concept. Ice phishing is a technique. So this is essentially where attackers are tricking users into signing transactions that give approvals to the attacker. What's shown on this slide is all familiar to you in terms of how approvals and token transfers work. This is how it looks like, right? When you do that, this is a Uniswap approval. It is very cryptic, right? If you look to the right here, the owner is just an address, the spender is an address. You don't even see that it is an approve message that you're signing. I know that MetaMask has improved over the last few weeks in that the information is a little bit clearer nowadays, but I think the average user, it is still fairly cryptic because basically you need to understand why there is approval. What is an approval? I think that is not very apparent to the average user. And so back in December, that has led to the Badger DAO attack. So the Badger DAO is a protocol. It has a dApp, a web interface. And what happened here was the attacker was able to obtain the Cloudflare API key. That happened back in September. And then in November, they essentially started to modify their front end to inject malicious code that would then cause a transaction to show up to end users that interacted with the dApp that then essentially would give approval to the attacker on all the user's assets. The attacker was very patient. They essentially, well, first of all, they didn't inject this script for every single user. They were actually smarter than that, in that when a user connected to the dApp, they had essentially the user's public key, the public address, and then they were able to query essentially on their backend, saying, "Oh, what sort of assets does the user have?" And if it was below a particular threshold, let's say $1,000, they said, we're not going to bother with that. We're not going to insert a transaction.
Real Robin Hood action going on there, like only steal from the rich.
Yeah, only steal from the rich, but I think the motivation there was not necessarily Robin Hood. I think it was more around staying under the radar and able to obtain as many token approvals for high net individuals as possible, such that they then can kind of drain from those users. And obviously it succeeded, because it was $120 million that they were able to steal.
This is an interesting one because it actually occurs during a busy time for hacking attacks, which is like during Thanksgiving and Christmas. We see an uptick in general for security attacks because they're smart enough to consider that like more people are on vacation that week, and more people that do security work are not around, paying attention to, oh, that's a lot of approvals that are racking up. And so even if there's a detection, from Forta, maybe nobody's there to notice the detection, or maybe the one guy around that week, sees too many to like catch you in the crowd.
Yeah.
So there's kind of interesting social engineering overlaps with this one as well.
Yeah, definitely. And this attack also happened in the bull market, right? So there was a lot of frenzy and a lot of FOMO. And I think that probably also played into the attacker's hand there. The other thing that you may hear about is rug pulls. So this is very interesting in that, I showed you how easy it is to create an ERC20 token, right? It is a few dozen lines of code, 5 functions that you need to implement, and you have a token. And so what happens is, people create tokens and then hype them with investors, and folks start buying the token, and the price goes up, and then the team behind the token essentially removes all liquidity. They sell all their tokens, they mint more tokens, and what that essentially then does, it kind of crashes the price. The people behind the project essentially get money, and all the people that invested into the token are left holding the bag. And there's 2 types of rug pulls. There's hard rug pulls and soft rug pulls. In a hard rug pull, the malicious code, or the code of the token, already indicates there's malicious intent to begin with. So you could envision that there is a token contract that allows you to buy tokens, but wouldn't allow you to sell tokens. That would be a hard rug pull. In a soft rug pull, maybe the intentions of the team is good at the beginning. They're able to attract users, they're behind their vision, they're working on it, but then something goes wrong with their project, and they decide to, cut their losses, and essentially run with all the users' funds. Yeah, so those are kind of the two types of rug pulls. Rug pulls are very popular. They were certainly more popular during the bull market, again, because of the FOMO, the fear of missing out. People were quick to invest into the projects. These days, I think on the rug pull front, it has been a little bit quieter. And then you see more phishing than rug pulls. Ransom attacks. So this was an attack from about a week or 2 weeks ago. This was related to the profanity vulnerability that I talked about earlier. And this was very interesting in that basically the attacker was able to take control of an address belonging to the Eden project. And but there was really no monetary value associated with that address. It wasn't an address that had permission to mint tokens or remove liquidity from one of their smart contracts. But it was an address that had permission to set the meta manager role of the Eden token contract. And what the meta manager role of the Eden token contract allowed them to do is to set the metadata of the token. So they were able to set the name and the symbol of the token. And what they decided to do is to deface the token. So they set the name to a derogatory term. And then they sent the Eden project a message on chain saying, we defaced your token, we control this address, and if you want it back, send us 200 ETH. And then they kind of deployed a contract that kind of made sure that that transfer was encoded in a smart contract, right? So if they deposit 200 ETH, then it would automatically transfer essentially the address back to the Eden team. This was the first ransom attack that I have observed. I thought it was very interesting. Obviously, in the Web 2 space, ransom attacks are very common. I hope they don't get common in the Web 3 space. But what happened, just kind of to end the story here, the Eden project essentially paid up. They paid the ransom, and the address was transferred back to the Eden project. I think the amount was not as high as 200 ETH. I think it was $60,000, which is more around 30, 40 ETH. And so certainly does not put out a good precedent here.
How does that resolve the underlying issue that your private key was compromised? I mean, what's interesting here is your private key was compromised. I presume that like there's an owner function here or something like that that is associated with that private key. So like, how do you know that you're not going to just get ransomed again next week when they decide that 60 wasn't enough?
Yeah, I think the role allowed them to set, so the deployer address allowed them to set the meta manager.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to double check, Colin.
It's just interesting, like, you know, when the underlying issue is like you lost your private key, and this probably just comes down to like how the folks at Eden wrote their contract, and I'm sure there's patterns to kind of deal with the fact that like if your private key is stolen, like maybe here's a way to get back to it. That just feels like a really tough one. I'd be curious what the postmortem is from them on how they talk about this and whether it's really a reliably closed door.
Yeah, I mean, if you have, let's say, a contract with an address that has a special role to manage that contract, and that address gets compromised, then the only solution would be to create a new address that is not compromised and then kind of replace the specific role with that address.
Well, like unless we have like a different wallet that manage the compromised one. So basically, like if they have a function to change the manager role of the hidden token contract, then yeah. But if they don't have that function, then I think the only solution is to change the contract address.
That's right. Like if they don't have that function, then they could, exactly as Colin said, compromised again. And
yeah, but I guess you could just then like read the state, write the state into a new contract and say Eden's not there, it's here, and we made it better this time so that we aren't going to lose our private key. But that feels rough. Like that feels like a really difficult.
Yes, it certainly does. Yeah, and to kind of replace a token with the newly deployed token is very, very challenging, because you have to think about that token is traded on centralized exchanges. It may be associated with liquidity pools on decentralized exchanges. People hold it, right? It's on bridges. And so it's very challenging to move from one to another.
I mean, presumably they could have been using the proxy approach as well, and just that maybe simplifies, the swap out the back end, correct the exposure that you had that led to your key being compromised, replay the state. And I mean, that still sounds like a horrible bridge to be a part of for resolving that incident, but it's a way.
Yeah, and I have to say that the ERC token standard, you don't see a lot of proxy implementations. And the reason for that, I think, is the fear of rug pulls, right? Because if you have, let's say, the Eden token contract and it's a proxy, then you're really entrusting that team to not rug pull you. So you often, you don't, like in the ERC 20 token center, you don't see a lot of proxy patterns, but it certainly would have helped in this particular case. Maximal extracted value. You also hear it referred to as miner extracted value, but it's not always associated with a miner. It can also be somebody that essentially front runs transactions. So as you know that the transactions sit in the mempool, unless you use flashbots or a private mempool, they sit in the mempool, can be observed. People that kind of analyze the mempool could take advantage of this situation. So let's assume I buy a lot of Bitcoin. I submit that to the mempool. It sits there with 100 gas. What the attacker can do is submit a transaction with a higher gas price that buys a lot of BTC for cheap. Then my transaction gets executed. I buy lots of BTC, price goes up, and then the attacker sells more expensive BTC. And so what happened here is essentially I would have bought BTC more expensive, right? Because the attacker essentially bought some beforehand, and then they dump it afterwards. And so now it's actually worth less without this set of transactions.
And literally the sequencing is enforced here just by the gas amounts, essentially. So I'm able to jump you in line by saying I'm willing to pay more gas to process this transaction. So the miner is going to pick that up first, and I can make sure that my buy happens before you and my sell happens after you, and I get the price benefit.
That's right. Now there's a way to kind of circumvent this or mitigate this risk. There's some called flash bots, where instead of you submitting your transaction to the mempool, you submit it to this separate network called the flashbot network. And the flashbot network integrates directly with the miner. And the miner kind of has to sign the block, including that transaction, without seeing what the transaction represents. So the miner is not able to front run you either when you use flashbots. But that system is much more expensive, because essentially what you're doing is when you submit a transaction to flashbots, you specify the miner reward directly, and usually it's in the order of, I mean, and in attack cases, it can be in the order of several ETH per transaction. And attackers use flashbots as well extensively. We talked about that smart contracts are deterministic, right? The block properties are controlled by the miner, and so if your smart contract relies on those, that's something that the miner can control and therefore extract potentially some value. Kind of a simple example was the gambling game that we already talked about. Smart contract exploits, we had a whole session on that, where we went through all the various different vulnerabilities, and with the Ethernet challenges, you'll get exposure to many of those and are going to exploit many of those. Flash loan, I think this is the last attack that I'm going to talk about. So this is a very interesting one. It's also referred to as an economic attack. So let me first explain what a flash loan is. A flash loan allows obtaining a large amount of digital assets for a small fee without collateralization. And the only reason why that works is a flash loan must be paid back in the same transaction with some interest. And the reason why this works is because a transaction is atomic, right? If your transaction fails, it reverts, then all kind of the state changes that were made by the transaction, including borrowing the digital assets from this flash loan provider, will revert. So it is as if you never borrowed those assets.
So like the whole point of flash loan, I think, is to like make profit, right? So is it like truly an attack, since the whole point of it is to make profit, and like the business logic of it is to give loan to someone and then like make profit?
Yeah, that's a great question, Duke. So flash loans itself is not an attack. Flash loans are utilized it's an important function in the market, in that it allows you to even out price inefficiencies through arbitrage without risking a lot of capital yourself, right? So you could look at Ethereum on Ethereum link pair on this decentralized exchange, and then Ethereum link pair on the other decentralized exchange, and you see some price inefficiency, and through a flash loan, you're able to take advantage of that. And so you're basically working to make sure that the prices across decentralized exchanges is equal, and that's an important function. And for that service, you essentially make a small profit, and that's called arbitrage.
And I guess the way this could be used in attack, though, is to basically get a force multiplier on, if you can find a single transaction exploit, something that works within the construct of a single transaction, this would let you go in without needing the assets to start with to go maximize the impact that you can have with that single attack. And, you know, the flash loan providers are happy because they take their cut, and everybody else is sad because, you know, you got to do $1 billion attack instead of a $100 attack with what you had available.
Yeah, let me explain to you how the attack works. So what this slide really shows is what flash loans are and how they're used in a legitimate case, right? So you can borrow, let's say, 1 million ETH from Aave. You do something with that ETH, like you know, evening out the price inefficiencies, and then you return that million ETH plus a fee to Aave. So that's kind of how flash loans work out of the box. That's what they're designed for. But an attack kind of abuses this in a way that goes beyond arbitrage. So in an attack, the flash loan can be used to manipulate the price of a token to drain funds from a smart contract. So think about a collateralized loan protocol, right? Where you are able to deposit one asset, let's say ETH, and you borrow another asset like USDC. Now, obviously, there is no credit score on the blockchain, and so the only way you're allowed to do that is by over collateralizing against what you're borrowing. So you have to deposit, let's say, $150,000 worth of ETH, and that allows you to borrow $100,000 with that collateral. And if the collateral percentage goes down, your collateral will get automatically liquidated to kind of cover the loan that you've taken out. And it sounds a little bit silly. Why would you want to deposit something that is worth more to borrow something that is less? I think I mentioned this the other day. One of the primary reasons is you don't want to have tax liability, because if you sell your asset or you change your asset, you have to pay tax, whereas you borrow against something, you don't have to pay tax. So let me explain how this works. And before I do that, I have to explain automated market makers. So these are essentially liquidity pools, right? That hold two tokens that then essentially can be used to exchange one token to another. So, you know, Uniswap is essentially an automated market maker. Uniswap works by having users deposit two different tokens, and then people are able to essentially exchange against those tokens. But what is important to remember here is that the price of a token is determined by the ratios of the two tokens in the liquidity contract. So if you look at, you know, if you have 100 ETH and 1,000 USDC, that means 1 ETH costs 10 USDC. If you have 200 ETH, 2,000 USDC, the price is still the same. But if the ratio starts changing, so 100 ETH and $3,000 USDC, then the ETH price is suddenly higher at 30 USDC. Okay, so that's kind of what automated market makers are. So they based on kind of the tokens that are deposited, you are able to get a price. And so in a way, they are a poor man's Oracle, because you can look at the ratio and that allows you to determine the price of a token. And so what an attacker is able to do is use a flash loan to essentially manipulate the ratio in a liquidity pool to manipulate the price. And what that then allows them to do is potentially exploit a vulnerable collateralized loan contract, because the collateralized loan contract will obtain the price information from the AMM. So let me walk you through this. So they could borrow 100,000 ETH and 1 million USDC from the flash loan provider. Then they take the 100,000 ETH and swap that for 2 million USDC. And what that will do is essentially it will lower the price of Ethereum in that AMM. So Ethereum now is much, much cheaper. Then they borrow 150,000 ETH and they deposit $2 million USDC as the collateral. And what that essentially then allowed them to do is get a profit here, right? They pay back then the 100,000 ETH and 1 million USDC plus the fee. And so they made 50 ETH in that transaction. So this is what really is meant by a flash loan attack. It's not about taking advantage of price inefficiencies in the system. It is more around using flash loans to manipulate prices that then allows them to kind of exploit protocols like collateralized lending protocols.
So this only works if like the lending, I guess like the liquidity pool is like really small, or you have a lot of money that you're using.
That is a good point, Mark. The trick here is that the flash loan provider, the lender, you can say, I want 100,000 ETH, or I want 10 million ETH. That's kind of how it's designed. You can basically get large quantities of tokens for a very, very small fee. And so with that, you are able to even manipulate liquidity pools that have a lot of liquidity, because you're able to temporarily get a large quantity.
I guess why doesn't this happen more frequently? If people just had like the capital to do this, you could just sponsor someone to do it for you.
The reason why this doesn't work, it doesn't happen more often, is because you need to have a vulnerability where essentially the collateralized loan protocol, the vulnerability here is that it obtains the price from an AMM.
Oh, okay.
And only from an AMM. What they should really be doing is obtaining the price from an oracle or from multiple AMMs and then averaging the prices, right? Like there's a variety of kind of mitigation techniques. But if you rely on one AMM,
Okay.
you get owned like that.
Gotcha. Okay. That makes sense. Thanks.
So then this is the last slide for today, just kind of best practices for end users. And next week, not next week, on Thursday, we will talk, this is kind of where you have a secure enclave or use a wallet with secure multi-party computation that does not store the key locally on your machine. Don't chase the big returns because they are usually pointing to a scam. Disconnect from sites and revoke token access, because even so, if I approve, like for instance, Uniswap, right? Uniswap is a reputable protocol. I trade there all the time. I approve that contract to act on my digital assets that is needed to interact with the DEX. But what if it gets hacked? what if there's a vulnerability, right? And so it's best to revoke token access after you completed whatever you were doing. Think about traditional security. As I mentioned, if you have malware on your machine or on your phone, it may steal your private keys. So kind of endpoint security and phish protection is something that I would recommend. Two-factor all your accounts. Passwords are not secure. Never share your seed phrase and private key. Don't store your seed phrase or private key in the clear. Again, kind of going back to malware that is actually looking for this. Another recommendation would be to use multiple accounts, where maybe you have a hot wallet that you have on your machine with very few digital assets, and you're interacting with protocols, but then for larger assets, you may want to kind of store that offline hardware wallet. And then lastly, one thing to consider is also buying insurance. There's a whole bunch of insurance protocols popping up that essentially secure your digital assets against hacks. And so that's a layered approach to security here, with insurance kind of being the last layer. All right, that was all I had. I